No one knows exactly when it began. There was no official announcement, no messenger crossing the empire's roads with a sealed parchment. What there was a strange silence, a heavy silence, as if the world itself were holding its breath. That night, the Roman watchman positioned on the easternmost walls of the empire sensed something different in the air. The winds didn't blow as before. The torches flickered aimlessly. And on the horizon, where before there had only been darkness, small lights began to appear. Not like stars, but like distant bonfires. Thousands of them. It was the first sign of what would later be remembered as the longest battle in Roman history, the Battle of 1,000 Nights. Rome at that time believed itself to be eternal. Its armies had marched through deserts, forests, and mountains. They had overthrown kings, burned cities, and written their authority with iron and blood. But there was one frontier that had never been completely tamed, a region of arid lands and endless plains, where nomadic tribes appeared and disappeared like shadows. For years, Rome believed that these people were nothing more than a distant nuisance, until that night. The first attack wasn't a real attack. There was no frontal assault, no clash of shields. Just arrows. Arrows fired from the darkness, silent, precise. They fell inside the Roman camp like an invisible rain. By the time the soldiers realized it, it was too late. Men screamed, horses reared up, and chaos spread rapidly. The enemy didn't advance. They attacked and vanished. It was like fighting against the desert itself. The Roman generals were furious. This wounded the pride of the empire. The next day, they ordered an immediate pursuit. Entire legions marched in perfect formation, with banners raised and armor gleaming in the sun. But they found no one. Only disappearing tracks, footprints erased by the wind, signs of hastily extinguished campfires. It was a war that followed no known rules. When the second night fell, the attacks returned. This time, more intense. Not just arrows, but swift raids, ambushes in the shadows, precise blows against isolated sentinels. The enemies knew every dune, every valley, every narrow passage. They fought only at night when darkness was their ally. At dawn, they vanished again. The Romans began to understand that this would not be a short campaign. Something much larger was brewing. As the nights wore on, morale began to crumble. Veteran soldiers who had survived countless battles began to dread the sunset. The night, once merely a break between marches, had become the true battlefield. Sleep was impossible. Every sound seemed like a warning of death. Every shadow, a lurking enemy. Reports spread quickly through the ranks. Some said the enemies were not ordinary men but spirits of the desert. Others swore they had seen warriors emerging from nowhere, as if the sand itself gave birth to them. Fear, more than weapons, began to weaken the Roman army. Still, Rome did not retreat. To retreat would mean admitting weakness. New troops were sent. New commanders took control. Makeshift fortifications were erected, but nothing seemed to work. Each night was a cruel repetition of the previous one, with slight variations that kept the soldiers constantly on alert, constantly exhausted. Then something changed. On the 10th night, the attacks ceased. No arrows, no screams, no movement. Silence returned, more oppressive than ever. Many believed the threat was over. Others, more experienced, knew it was just a pause, a breather before something worse. They were right. The following night, the enemy did not attack the camp. They attacked the supply lines. Allied cities began to fall one by one. Messengers were found dead on the roads, their bodies marked with strange symbols. Rome was being slowly surrounded, not by walls but by attrition, hunger, and fear. The generals gathered. For the first time, they quietly admitted that they were facing an enemy unlike any other. An enemy that did not seek a quick victory but a long one. A victory built night after night, attack after attack, until the empire, too weary to fight, simply collapsed. And so, without realizing it, the Romans entered the first phase of the 1,000-night battle, a war with no end in sight, a war where time was the most powerful weapon. Each night won by the enemy was not just a military defeat, but an open wound in the soul of the empire. When the moon rose again in the sky, illuminating the desert with its cold light, the Roman soldiers understood something terrible. That battle would not be decided by a single glorious victory, but by the ability to resist. And many were already beginning to doubt whether Rome could hold out for 1,000 nights. The real battle was only just beginning. When the second full moon appeared since the beginning of the conflict, the Romans no longer counted the nights. Time had become an invisible enemy, slipping through their fingers like sand. Men woke up without knowing exactly what day it was. They only knew that when the sun set, the battle would begin again, and it always did. The night attacks became more intelligent. They were no longer simple ambushes. Now there was coordination, rhythm, clear intent. Small groups attacked different points simultaneously, forcing the Romans to split up. When one legion rushed to contain one fire, another would emerge at the other end of the camp. It was a cruel dance, conducted by commanders who were never seen, only sensed. The Romans tried to adapt. They began reinforcing the sentries, doubling shifts, and keeping fires burning all night. But the fire, which was supposed to bring security, ended up becoming a problem. It revealed positions, created treacherous shadows, and further tired the eyes of the guards. The enemies knew this. They used the light against them, moving precisely where their vision failed. Gradually, physical exhaustion transformed into something deeper, a mental burnout. Soldiers began to hear sounds that weren't there. Some swore they heard footsteps even in complete silence. Others awoke screaming, convinced they were being attacked, only to realize they had dreamed it. The line between wakefulness and rest disappeared. It was in this climate that the first serious breach of Roman discipline occurred. On a seemingly peaceful night, a group of exhausted and desperate soldiers abandoned their post. They fled into the desert, believing it was better to face the unknown than to continue in that endless torture. They were never found. The next day, their shields were found embedded in the sand, lined up as if someone wanted to send a message, a clear message. There was no escape. The commanders began to understand that they were dealing with psychological warfare. Each attack was less about immediate deaths and more about constant attrition. The enemies wanted Rome to consume itself from within, and they were succeeding. Meanwhile, rumors reached other borders. Tribes that had once feared the empire began to stir. Some stopped paying tribute. Others closed strategic roads. The thousand-night battle was no longer confined to the desert. Its effects spread like cracks in an ancient wall. Even so, Rome persisted. New orders came from the capital: resist at all costs. Defeat was not an option. The empire could not allow a faceless war, fought in the shadows, to become a symbol of weakness. To retreat would mean inviting chaos on all its borders. Then came the night that changed everything. There were no scattered attacks, no arrows flying in the dark. There was silence. A silence so profound it seemed artificial. No insects, no wind, no distant sounds. The lookouts tensed. Something was wrong. Everyone felt it. Suddenly, a single sound echoed through the desert. A drum. Deep, slow, rhythmic. A sound that didn't come from a specific point but seemed to surround the entire camp. Soon others joined in. Dozens. Hundreds. The ground vibrated slightly beneath the feet of the Roman soldiers. Then they appeared. For the first time since the beginning of the war, the enemy showed itself in great numbers. Silhouettes emerged from the darkness, forming irregular but imposing lines. They did not advance running. They walked, slowly, as if they knew that time was on their side. The Romans reacted as they always did: close formation, shields raised, spears at the ready. But something was different. The fear, accumulated over so many nights, weighed heavily on their arms. Their muscles responded, but their minds hesitated. The clash was brutal. Screams, metal against metal, dust and blood. For the first time, the Romans managed to push the enemy back. There were casualties on both sides, At dawn, the field was covered with bodies. Many believed that this had been the turning point, that they had finally forced the enemy to fight under their rules. But that was exactly what the enemy wanted. The following night, the attacks returned, fiercer than ever. Now, in addition to ambushes, there were direct attacks combined with fire. Warehouses were set ablaze. Horses were released in panic. Roman logistics began to crumble. Without enough food, without rest, without security, the army began to wither. Some officers suggested negotiating. Others spoke of a strategic retreat. But these words were dangerous. In Rome, negotiating with shadows was unthinkable. To retreat without a clear victory was almost treason. As the nights wore on, the war took on a rhythm of its own. Attack, silence, attack again. An endless cycle. Each night took something from the Romans. A little strength, a little hope, a little identity. They still wore Roman armor, still carried Roman standards, but they no longer felt invincible. The veterans began to notice something terrifying. The enemy didn't seem to tire. While the Romans aged night after night, the attacks maintained the same intensity. It was as if they were fighting against a constant current, a tide that never fully receded. It was then that the question arose that no one dared to ask aloud. What if this battle never ends? What if the objective was not to defeat Rome in open battle, but to keep it trapped there, bleeding slowly until the empire itself no longer had the strength to hold its borders? The Battle of 1,000 Nights was not just a war. It was a test of endurance, of identity, of limits. And at that point, it was already clear that Rome was being pushed far beyond what it had ever imagined. When the sun rose again, illuminating faces marked by exhaustion and fear, the soldiers knew they had crossed a point of no return. The war was now a part of them, and many more nights lay ahead. At that stage of the war, the night was no longer just darkness. It had weight. It had presence. As the sun began to hide on the horizon, an automatic silence spread among the Roman soldiers like a somber ritual. No one needed to give orders. Everyone knew that from that moment on, every breath needed to be measured, every step calculated, every sound contained. The Battle of 1,000 Nights had entered its most cruel phase. The attacks now came in unpredictable waves. Some nights were marked by absolute violence, with simultaneous assaults on various points of the camp. On others, nothing happened. No arrows, no sound. And these empty nights were, paradoxically, the worst. Uncertainty gnawed at the men's minds. Sleep had become impossible. The body demanded rest, but the mind refused to switch off. Over time, strange reports began to emerge. Soldiers claimed to have seen figures walking among the tents, even when everyone was gathered together. Others swore that voices whispered their names in the dark. Some believed they were being watched all the time, even when they were alone. The line between reality and imagination slowly dissolved. The commanders tried to react by imposing extreme discipline. Severe punishments were applied to any sign of weakness, but this only increased the climate of tension. The fear of the enemy was compounded by the fear of the Roman hierarchy itself. The external war had also become an internal war. It was during this period that the event occurred that would become known among the survivors as the Night of the Disappearance. Without warning, an entire wing of the Roman camp simply ceased to exist. At dawn, the soldiers sent to check the area found torn tents, campfires forcibly extinguished, and signs of fighting everywhere. But there were no bodies. None. Hundreds of men had vanished in the middle of the night, as if swallowed by the desert. The psychological impact was devastating. If before the Romans feared death, now they feared something worse: disappearance without explanation. The idea of dying fighting was acceptable, but to be taken away, without glory, without witnesses, without a record, that corroded the soul. The enemies never claimed the feat. They left no symbols. They sent no messages. Silence was the message. Meanwhile, the situation outside the battlefield was rapidly deteriorating. Supply routes were virtually cut off. Allied cities began to rebel or close their gates to the Romans. fearing reprisals from the invisible enemy. The army, once a symbol of order and power, was now seen as a magnet for destruction. The generals sent desperate reports to the capital. They pleaded for reinforcements, new strategies, and permission to retreat. Responses were slow in coming, and when they did, they were vague, distant, disconnected from the brutal reality of the desert. Rome was too far away to understand what was really happening there. As the nights passed, some soldiers began to question everything they believed in: the empire, the glory, the promise that Rome would always win. Many had dedicated their entire lives to that idea. Now it seemed fragile, almost illusory. Even so, there was resistance. A hard core of veterans refused to give in. They had seen empires fall and rise. They knew that every war had a limit. They believed that at some point the enemy would make a mistake. All they had to do was resist. But the enemy made no mistakes. They attacked when the Romans were most tired. They disappeared when there was a chance for a counterattack. They never fought without an advantage. Every movement seemed calculated with infinite patience, as if they were willing to fight not for months, but for years if necessary. At a certain point, the Romans realized something disturbing. The attacks were becoming less lethal, but more frequent. The enemy was no longer seeking heavy casualties. They sought to maintain the cycle, to maintain the pressure, to keep Rome trapped in that psychological trap. It was a war of absolute attrition. Then, on a moonless night, something different happened. A small group of enemies approached the camp without attacking. They remained in sight at a safe distance, illuminated only by the stars. One of them stepped forward a few paces and raised his hands, showing that he was unarmed. The silence was total. He spoke in an unknown language, but his tone was clear. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact. One of the Roman interpreters, after much effort, managed to understand part of the message. That was no ordinary invasion. It wasn't a war for territory or riches. It was a response to decades of Roman advance, of impositions, of the destruction of ways of life. That battle wasn't aimed at destroying Rome immediately. It was aimed at making it feel the weight of its own eternity. The message ended with a phrase that chilled the commanders to the bone. "As long as you remain, the night will continue." Then the messenger retreated and disappeared into the darkness like all the others. From that moment on, the war took on a new meaning. It was no longer just about winning or losing. It was about deciding how much suffering Rome was willing to endure to maintain its position. Each night became a silent choice, to resist or to admit the limit. The soldiers began counting the nights again. They didn't know if they would reach 1,000. They didn't know if anyone would ever hear that story. But they knew they were caught up in something bigger than any previous battle. When the sun rose, weak and pale, illuminating an exhausted and broken army, it became clear that the Battle of 1,000 Nights was approaching its decisive moment. Not with a grand confrontation, but with a decision that would change the fate of the empire forever. On the night that many believed to have been the 1,000th, no one celebrated. There was no official count, no mark engraved in stone. The very idea of numbers had long since lost its meaning. What remained was a reduced army, aged prematurely, standing between the desert and its own pride. The 1,000-night battle had consumed everything that could be consumed. Only the final decision remained. The Roman commanders gathered in silence. There were no more fiery speeches, no promises of glory, only weary eyes and hoarse voices. They knew that winning this war in the traditional way was impossible. The enemy did not seek immediate destruction, nor would they accept a formal surrender. Remaining there meant continuing to fuel an endless cycle of attrition. Advancing meant going even deeper into territory they could not conquer. Only one choice remained, a choice Rome rarely made: retreat. The order wasn't announced as a defeat. It was presented as a strategic redistribution. But, deep down, everyone knew what it represented. For the first time, Rome accepted that there was a limit to its expansion, that not every battle needed to be won with bloodshed, that sometimes survival was the only possible form of victory. The retreat began before dawn. No trumpet sounded, no banner was raised. The legions dismantled their camp in silence as if afraid to awaken something asleep beneath the sand. Each step backward was heavy, not only from physical exhaustion, but from the symbolic weight of that moment. And then, something unexpected happened. That night there was no attack, no arrow pierced the air. No shadow moved among the dunes, no drum echoed on the horizon. For the first time since the beginning of the war, the night was simply night. Dark, silent, indifferent. The Roman soldiers, incredulous, waited. They remained on alert until dawn, but nothing happened. In the following days, as the army withdrew from the region, the pattern remained the same. No attack, no pursuit. It was as if the enemy had accomplished its objective and, satisfied, simply disappeared back into the vastness of the desert. Some soldiers felt relief. Others, a strange emptiness. The war had become part of their lives. The silence now seemed deafening. Many continued to wake in the middle of the night, waiting for the attack that never came. The battle of 1,000 nights had not ended only on the field. It continued within them. When the reports finally reached Rome, they caused shock. The empire had not been defeated in direct combat, but neither had it won. It was the kind of outcome that didn't fit into the glorious records of Roman history. Therefore, many tried to downplay what had happened. Some called it a failed campaign, others a strategic retreat. Few dared to tell the whole story, but among the veterans the truth was preserved. They spoke of a faceless war, fought in the shadows, where time was the deadliest weapon. They spoke of an enemy that never sought applause, never raised flags, never asked for recognition. An enemy that taught Rome the hardest lesson of all. Not all power is conquered by force, and not every victory comes with a field full of defeated enemies. The Battle of 1,000 Nights changed the empire silently, yet profoundly. After that episode, Rome began to act more cautiously on certain borders. There were regions that were never fully conquered again. Generals began to consider not only the enemy's strength, but also their patience, their willingness to fight without haste, without a deadline. The soldiers who survived carried invisible scars. Many never slept the same way again. For them, night was no longer just an interval between days. It became a reminder, a symbol of everything they had faced and everything Rome almost lost. Over time, the story transformed into legend. Some exaggerated the numbers. Others doubted that 1,000 nights had truly passed. But no one denied the essential fact. There was a battle that wasn't decided in a single day, nor in a single victory. A battle that was won not by steel, but by resilience, patience, and an understanding of human limitations. And perhaps that is why this story has survived, not as a song of glory, but as a warning. The empire that believed itself to be eternal learned, in that silent war, that even the greatest forces in the world must recognize when persisting is more dangerous than retreating. The 1,000-night battle did not destroy Rome, but it showed that Rome could bleed. And that knowledge, more than any military defeat, changed the course of history. When the last soldier left the desert behind, the wind erased the marks of the camp, as if nothing had happened. But in the memory of those who lived through it, the war remained alive, because some battles never truly end. They merely transform into stories waiting to be remembered.